Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are you doing? It is Friday. I hope you've all had a good week. I have had a busy one. Tired eyes, hence the glasses, right? So good morning. If you're joining live, good morning. Thank you for joining. Please do say good morning in the chat. And if you are watching on the replay, then welcome. Thank you for joining. And today, so you haven't had one of these for a while. This is just me doing, some people call it a monologue, me just sort of talking about a particular topic that we wanted to dive into. But yeah, just me, no guest this morning. And I'm talking about how to launch an ERG because I have actually had quite a few clients very recently asking me, how they can start an employee resource group. And as you can see on the stats there, something like 90% of large US organizations have ERGs. I don't seem to be able to find stats for a UK company. So if anybody can find that, please do drop it into the chat. But 90% of large US companies and almost 1 in 5 of mid-sized companies have employee resource groups. So it covers approximately 43% of employees. So the 43% is a 2024 statistic. The 90% one has been around for a little bit longer. Those of you that know will know. So what I'm going to cover today is why do you want an ERG? And that's kind of where I always start when people come to me and say, we want to start an employee resource group or an employee network. Why do you want one? Well, what is an employee resource group? I'll talk a little bit about that. What do you need in terms of data? We're talking quite a lot at the moment about our DE&I initiatives being data-led. So what is it that you need in terms of data? How do you set one up? So what are the practicalities, the logistics, who's involved, who gets to come to meetings, etc. A little bit of a sticky topic, or it can be. And then ERGs 3.0, what is in for the future of employee resource groups? Where do I see them going to? So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. In terms of what are they, if you're not familiar with the term ERG or employee resource group, some of the other terms that you hear are employee networks or employee-led networks or business resource groups. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, or affinity networks. So affinity as in, for a particular community or identity, an employee network that meets and comes together and works on challenges and issues. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get into this. So I always say start with why. Obviously not my saying, Simon Sinek, or is it Sinek? I'm never quite sure. So we start with why in terms of what are the benefits of employee resource group? Why do organizations start them? So typically, some of the obvious benefits, and I would say the top one actually is creating a sense of belonging. So if you were to search some of the ERG content that's currently being posted on LinkedIn, you will see a lot of it is around Pride Month. And this is something when I talk to quite a few employee networks that are Pride networks in particular, or LGBTQ or inclusion networks, they talk about this one particularly. We know that individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community can sometimes have challenges in terms of being accepted either within their own family, within their own community, or feeling like they are accepted and they belong. So actually creating communities like that in the workplace can help with that sense of belonging and that sense of, I can actually be myself. I feel as though I can be myself because now there are others that are like me, etc. So creating a sense of belonging is one of the real benefits. ERGs can help with things like policies. So they can help to review policies and make sure that they're inclusive, and advise on changes, etc. And also then things like networking, mentoring, career growth, development, advancement. And also one of the final benefits that I want to mention is attracting different types of talent, particularly younger talent, actually. So the statistics that we're hearing at the moment, your Gen Zers really are looking for things like investments in employee networks and ways that the company can show that it is actually serious about inclusion and serious about welcoming people from different backgrounds. So these are one of the benefits of employee resource groups. In terms of data, now we're gonna really sort of like delve into the data, but you do need to start with an understanding of, well, what are the issues? What is it that we're trying to solve here? And I've put there at the bottom, when you know your why, you'll know your way. So actually, what is the data telling you about what the issues are, or about the benefits or the improvements that you're trying to make. It's really important that you use data where possible. And if you haven't got the data, and we'll talk a little bit about this, if you haven't got all of the data that you would like, even just anecdotally, what are you hearing, or can you actually do something quite informally where you start to hold a series of interviews to try to understand what are the issues so that you get a clearer sense of what your why is. Pull versus push. We will talk about that in terms of, is this a pull? Is this a pull in terms of, are employees actually wanting this, or is this just something that is being kind of, driven top down? Is it that people top down are kind of trying to push it onto the employee network? So that is definitely something to think about. You don't want it to be just a case of, which I have had happen to me in the past. A client has approached me and basically said, we want to start employee networks because we've seen that our competitors have them, and we think that this is the norm within our industry. And I sort of said, well, are you confident that your employees actually want them? And for example, if say you are thinking of starting, I don't know, let's say a ethnicity network or a faith-based network, do you even have enough employees to start one? So it's, you've really got to think about the pull versus push. There is something about when you start it, making sure that the interest is actually there, making sure that the need is actually there, and you're not just creating it just to jump on the bandwagon of the latest DEI initiative, right? And then managing expectations. So I'm going to come on to this very shortly, but one of the references that I dropped in the comments for this LinkedIn Live, so if you're looking at the comments, was an article that I did for Medium around employee resource groups not being a quick fix. So if there are challenges that you've got, particularly for specific groups, you may have specific underrepresented groups, and you're seeing some challenges and you're hearing maybe that there are some engagement or morale issues, don't think that the creation of an employee resource group is going to change things overnight, because it's not. So you really have to manage those expectations, again, linked to why is it that you're doing it, but understanding that regardless of that why, and hopefully it's quite a big, ambitious why, but understanding that everything's not going to be fixed overnight. And this is the reason why. So, gosh, that's really small. But the ERG maturity model, which is something that that I designed last year in collaboration with a few key clients, and then got feedback, some of it from here on LinkedIn. So thank you if you were part of that feedback. But there is a typical journey that employee resource groups go on, and sometimes what I see is some clients wanting to literally start an employee resource group and almost jump straight to level 3 or 4 in terms of, we're starting to progress individuals from certain backgrounds or with certain lived experience before they've even started at the start, which is around things like raising awareness and building community. So this thing around managing expectations is really important. If you're starting an employee resource group, please do not think that everything is going to be resolved overnight, because it isn't. And this maturity model here, based on the clients that I've been working with and some of the actually very mature networks that I've seen, it can take networks a good 4, 5 years or even longer to get anywhere near the top, right? To get anywhere near where they're getting, advancement of individuals within that community, where the employee resource group has now become more of a strategic resource group that actually operates much more widely than just looking at the needs of the employees. So don't be too impatient is one of the things I would say. It definitely is not a quick fix. It's a slow burn. Let's get on to data. And you'll notice I'm going at pace. That's because I've got somewhere to be at 9 o'clock, right? So I'm kind of rattling through this a little bit. If you have got any more questions and I don't get a chance to answer them, please do just drop me a DM. So in terms of data, what is the data that you need? We're talking very much at the moment, particularly around anything to do with diversity, equity and inclusion. It needs to be data driven or data led. Hopefully I'm going to have Makalonge, the founder and CEO of the Equal Group, which specializes in data-led EDI, on here back again shortly, talking about the industry and all things data. So when it comes to data, the first thing I would say is work with your HR colleagues. Really important. Or if you have a business information team or a performance management or management reporting team within your organization, you might be lucky that you may have some sort of resource that you can go to and talk about the sorts of data that you might like. And, typically we are looking at things like, I'm going to use this term, the employee life cycle. So everything from attracting employees into the organization to selection and onboarding to then hopefully for some employees, progression within the organization, and obviously engagement and how people are feeling while they're in the organization, and then things like attrition. So how quickly are people leaving? What's our retention like across different communities and different demographics? So that's typically where the data tends to start, kind of just measuring that and just sort of seeing what does it look like. And for the communities that we think we need to create employee resource groups, how does that compare to the rest of the organizations? That's typically where the data starts. So I would say, first of all, work with the teams of people that are already doing the data. Don't take this challenge on yourself. So if you are an employee who is not in HR or in D&I, don't think that you're suddenly going to start to boil the ocean and start to create and monitor and manage lots of data, because that in itself could almost become a full-time job. And we know that one of the biggest challenges for ERG leaders is time and capacity. So I would strongly encourage you to go and have these conversations with your HR team, with D&I, with your performance management teams, if you do have that capability internally. The one thing I would say is just beware of analysis paralysis, as in this is a term I came across a long time ago when I used to be an accountant. I used to be in finance full time. Sometimes we don't move, we don't do anything because we're so busy analyzing the data. So sometimes I have had some clients where they have asked me to come in and help them with some of their challenges. And when it comes to the data, they've sort of said, oh, I'm not sure we can do anything because we don't have enough data. And sometimes they're really small clients, like, maybe 100 employees in total. And I'm like, how much data do you actually need? If you've already run things like staff surveys, etc., you've actually already got some data there. And actually, you could just go and ask people, what they think and what's happening, So don't let the lack of data necessarily be a blocker to you starting. You can always start and then get the data as you progress, and as you mature. So don't be paralyzed by lack of data. And then the other thing around data as well, and one of the reasons for sometimes not starting, is people are sometimes worried about the fact that the data that you have that's available maybe isn't so insightful. So maybe the data that you really want to measure, which for example could be a pay gap, you may be in an organization. So for example, if you are in the UK and you have less than 250 employees, there may not be that much data because you don't technically have to report a lot of data. So you might be scratching around for things. And actually, even when it comes to employee survey data, because of the size of the population, if you're too small, you might be breaching confidentiality. So again, it might actually be difficult to get some of this data. So sometimes we're tempted to just go for the data that's there. But there's often a trade-off in that sometimes the data that is available may not be the most insightful. And it might be a case of actually, do you need to commission a piece of data? I had a really interesting LinkedIn Live a few weeks ago. I can't remember what date it was, with Damini, and we were talking about equal pay audits, which is a really insightful piece of data, but that might be something that needs to be commissioned, right? Also things like data around advancement and promotions, so who is advancing through the organization and who is not, is a very insightful piece of data, but it's often not readily available. Some organizations have got this down to a T. Some very large organizations have got very sophisticated talent management and talent monitoring systems that can give you a lot of insight. The other thing I would say about that is you need to know how to interpret data, or you need to have somebody that knows how to interpret the data. I had a call with a client, I'm going to say maybe about 6 or 7 weeks ago, and they were having some challenges around attrition. So people leaving the organization very quickly, a high churn rate. And when I was asking some questions about the data that they've got, and they've got an external third party providing some of this data into the organization and the network, I was sort of challenging, almost like, for, okay, well, what's the so what? And what is the root cause of that data that you're seeing? So sometimes it's not even just about having the data, it's having somebody that can interpret the data. And that skill set may sit, if you've got a performance management team, it may sit within that team, may sit within finance. So my last finance role a long time ago was looking after financial planning and analysis. So I was very much into what is this data telling us? And you do need to have that lens. It's not data just for the sake of data. And the other thing here, in terms of the data, I've got here employee plus, in terms of, especially as you start to mature as an organization, you want to look beyond just the employee data, because as you start to become more strategic with this employee resource group, and actually if we were to look back to the very first employee resource group on record, that is, which is at Xerox, the reason for starting that employee resource group was actually driven by challenges that were going on in the community. It was actually being driven by the civil rights movement of the late 60s. And actually, the data that would have been more useful at the time for that employee resource group was actually representation in terms of from a community perspective. So what's going on out in the community, and then how is that reflected or not in the organization? I've been doing some work with a particular employee network who shall not be named, but one of the exercises that we did right at the start was actually getting some of that external data. What does the community look like that we serve? What do our customers look like? What's the diversity there, etc. So with your data, look beyond, just your employee population in terms of even like, figuring out the why and figuring out what it is that you're trying to do. Right, let's go to the setup. So let's get practical now. Let's get very practical about, so how do you actually do this thing? I've started off here with culture, and by culture, I mean company culture. What is the company culture when it comes to getting things done, when it comes to, kind of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary team working, when it comes to project structures, etc., because that will give you an idea as to how the employee network will run. And when I've run big change programs, big transformation, I've seen lots of different types of culture, and it's not really determined by the size, in terms of big companies versus small. There is something around complexity, and there is definitely something around global, but each company, and often actually each location, is quite different. So you want it to be set up in a way, in terms of the level of structure, the level of oversight, etc., how many meetings, the formality, the rigidity, in a way that works for your organization. Don't just kind of go to the internet and Google how to set up an ERG and just follow it word for word, as in like a cookie cutter way of doing it, because it just may not work for your organization, right? So that's why culture is quite important. And it links nicely onto the structure and the governance. So I've led massive transformation programs for two particular organizations who I will contrast. The one was an organization where it was very difficult to get decisions made, very, very bureaucratic, very structured, very formal, quite a slow pace, right? So you can imagine what an employee network and setting one up might look like in that organization. You might actually have to have quite a few meetings with senior leaders first to say, we're thinking about setting up an employee network. And you literally might need to go through that loop 2 or 3 times before you even then start to engage your employees, right? Because that's the culture. It's maybe a culture that is quite risk averse. Okay, so you've got a risk averse culture, lots of conversations with senior leaders to say, this is what we're thinking of. Have you got any concerns, etc. I contrast that then to another large global organization that I worked with. Their culture is very fast paced, a lot less rigor actually in terms of how they got things done, which sometimes meant that that's probably why I started using the saying done is better than perfect. So things may not be perfect, but they would get done. A lot less kind of governance and oversight, and more autonomy was given to different divisions. So setting up an employee network in that organization would probably look very different. And what it might result in is you actually start some informal conversations with a group of employees, right, that might be interested to say, look, we're thinking of starting this thing. Shall we start to think about what it could look like? What are the pros? What are the cons in terms of how we approach it? And you would actually work through some of the things that we've talked about. So you're almost going to then co-create it with the employees. So talk about the why, talk about the data, talk about some of the challenges, talk about what you're trying to achieve, talk about how you want to meet, etc. So those are the almost like the two different ends of the spectrum. So very top down cultures where it's kind of like very structured. Then you want to start with senior leadership in terms of just making sure that they're comfortable with the approach that you're going to take before you actually then go out to the employees. If it's a more kind of fluid and slightly kind of more fast-paced culture, then actually you can start with the employees. You know, you maybe want to get a little bit of senior leadership buy-in from somewhere, at least with the HR director or chief people officer or whatever they're called. But you can start really with the group of employees and co-create it, get the employees in the room and start to see where the natural employee network leadership starts to come out as well. Because one of the things that I talk about in the maturity model is that sometimes employee networks, especially if it's more push than pull, so if it's more HR or the DE&I team saying we should have networks, it's sometimes hard to then switch that into the employees are taking ownership. So it's hard for it to become an employee-led network. It's easier to do that if you get employees in the room from the jump, right? So right from the off, have employees in the room co-creating what the network will look like and what the scope will be of the network. That will be easier for you to get it owned by employees and for you to start to get traction in terms of engagement and meetings going, etc. And then the role of HR and or D&I, if you have the luxury of having D&I, is just to help to provide that structure and that governance. But really, the network kind of runs itself within a framework, okay, within a set of boundaries. In terms of what that governance looks like and how much structure to have, this really does link into culture, as I was saying, but it absolutely does need some governance, right? There does need to be some sort of terms of reference or ways of working for the network that is, kind of shared a little bit more widely outside of the network, certainly, signed off by HR, DEI. And then at this point, you've probably got some sort of senior leadership involvement, but those terms of reference in terms of, what are we allowed to do as a network? And or when do we need to check in with somebody? And it could be around resources, in terms of committing the organization to spend, to external expenditure. But it could also be around things like communication, particularly external communication. This is a biggie, and some networks have got into a little bit of hot water, and there have been some challenges, and some organizations have maybe been slightly embarrassed about, things that have maybe come out. And I just put that down to the governance, as in there isn't governance that said, if this network is producing a publication that goes external, it must be reviewed by PR, for example. And that is critical, right? Which would be the norm anyway for any activity that's going external. You would normally get it reviewed by, somebody in PR/external affairs, etc. So that sort of governance is key, around things like use of resources, expenditure of any money or budget, and also comms, particularly if it's going external. And then something for me around the setup in terms of, do you want this to be organic and just like an employee network that, kind of just evolves? You get people in a room, it evolves, and you kind of see where it goes. Or do you want to be a bit more formulaic about how it's run? And the formulaic bit, like I was saying, you can Google ERG playbook, and there are some great playbooks on the on the web. A lot of them are quite American because obviously the US model is perhaps more advanced. So you could, they're certainly out there, and they will tell you about the standard roles that you have in terms of somebody that's responsible for planning the events, because the calendar and awareness days are kind of, I guess, part of the bread and butter of employee resource groups, you know, alongside things like awareness training or lunch and learns or whatever. There's a whole thing around the types of events. And I did a post on Tuesday, I think it was this week, about some of the types of events. So in terms of the setup of the employee resource group, you know, are you going to have fixed roles, you know, somebody that's responsible for events, somebody that's responsible for the communication, one chair or two co-chairs, which is incredibly popular. So you're going to have two co-chairs, and other roles. So you can go down that route, or, you know, when you're setting up, you can keep it a little bit more fluid and organic and just kind of see what shakes out, see who kind of constantly turns up to the meetings and see where the strengths are. I will say one of the strengths actually that I see in some networks, which is critical, is project management. The people that have project management skills, or executive assistants is the other skill. People that are good at detail and getting things done are a fantastic resource to have in these networks. So definitely thinking about playing to skills and strengths when you're setting up the networks, which kind of takes us on to who is involved in terms of who should be, you know, invited along to, I guess, those initial meetings, and or then once the network has started, things like your planning meetings, your planning, your progress meetings, etc., talking about the sorts of things that you want to do. Now, this is a little bit of a bone of contention, I'm not going to lie, and I've heard all sorts of different things and combinations. I think, again, this links to your culture and is definitely something for you, the group of employees, to discuss. The one thing I would just be aware of is not becoming too siloed, because, you know, as I'll talk about on my last slide, I think ERGs are really moving away from being siloed. I think there's real benefit in doing this work together and looking at the interests of different communities and different identities together and working on those challenges together. So in terms of who's going to be involved in those initial meetings, you can have it as the community of interest or that particular identity only, or you can have it broader than that. You can have allies in the room. As I was saying, you know, you can have senior leaders that are involved in this conversation, you know, at the start, and then kind of figuring out, well, what does it look like? You know, is there maybe a meeting cadence that says, actually, you know, we might have, if, say, for example, we're meeting every month, maybe we have, you know, one or two meetings that are just the community only, and then we maybe have one or two which is allies, senior leaders, exec sponsor, etc. There are all sorts of combinations and ways to doing it. What I would strongly recommend, though, is that you don't have meetings that are just the community all the time. Don't do that, because it just doesn't create the best dynamic for collaboration and also for diversity of thought. Okay, diversity of thought and innovation in terms of how you are running the network. Okay, so that's my really strong advice. And, you know, reaching out to other networks just leads on to my final slide before I dash off this morning. Where I think employee resource groups are going, I've got them more in common. There's an organisation that I'm aware of, and I'm trying to get them on here to have a chat about this. But their model for employee networks is slightly different. They don't have individual identity-based networks. They have one group, and it's called More in Common. I think below that, they do potentially have affinity chapters or affinity meetings, but they have one employee network that comes together and talks about all of the challenges, etc. And I think we're going to see more of that. That's what I'm predicting. You heard it here first. The volunteer model. Now, in the US, more organizations are starting to pay and reward the employee resource group leaders for doing this work on top of their day job. Some organizations give employees time. So some organizations might say, okay, you know, you've got 2 hours a week to work on employee network. I mean, I do know a lot of them don't actually reduce their day job, so I don't know where somebody's going to magic those 2 hours a week, but that is what's often said. But certainly here in the UK, I see the volunteer model continuing for some time, I think, until that changes. Data driven, that is going to be more important, just because DEI in and of itself is becoming more data driven, which obviously is a good thing, right? And then strategic business resource groups, that's what BRG stands for. And I definitely think, and my hope actually, is that employee resource groups do become more business focused. So getting involved in things like inclusive marketing and focus groups around things like marketing, we probably wouldn't have a lot of the marketing faux pas that we see if you had employee resource groups being consulted, right? So inclusive marketing is something that I see. Supplier diversity programs actually is something that even the very first ERG at Xerox, that kind of led and was involved in supply diversity program. It's fascinating if you have time to go and research that. And those are just two of the areas. And also then the wider community, sorry, so the one last thing, the external community. I love it when I see employee resource groups going out to talk to schools, colleges, universities, the wider community, having an influence in your sector, in your industry, etc. I think that's absolutely amazing. And that is where I see employee resource groups going forward. That's it for today. Whistle Stop Tour. If you've got any questions, either drop them in the comments or send me a DM. But that is it. Hope you have an amazing weekend. If you are starting an employee resource group, check out the employee resource group maturity model to make sure that you do manage those expectations. And best of luck. All right, take care, guys. Bye.